In part one of this presentation, I would like to talk about CSS. But before I do that, let me draw your attention to the picture we have on the slide. So this is the portrait of Hakon William Lee, and I apologize for my terrible Norwegian pronunciation. But this is the face of the person who was working with Team Berners-Lee, who is credited for developing CSS. Now, what is CSS? CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And the important thing to remember about CSS is that it's a separate language with its own syntax and rules, but CSS, unlike HTML, is only responsible for the presentation of the pages. So while HTML is used for defining and specifying what types of contents you have, CSS, on the other hand, is defining how this content will need to be presented. In other words, using CSS, you are making sure you provide specific rules on how the browser should render and show this particular HTML elements to users. So what are the main benefits of CSS then? So what CSS allows you to do is to separate these two very important elements of web development, the actual development of the content, from how this content will need to be presented. There are lots of benefits behind using CSS. Nowadays, it's impossible to think of a website which is not using CSS. However, one of the easiest things to get your head around CSS is to think about developing one set of rules and applying them to more than one pages. Yeah? So let's think of this as one of the benefits of using CSS. Now, I would like to show you a quick demonstration where having one HTML file, but different ways of presenting this actually works really, really well. So I would like to open up this website called CSS Zen Garden, and to demonstrate how dramatically a simple HTML page can change depending on the CSS that is actually applied to the HTML. So let me open up the browser very quickly, and I'll Google CSS Zen Garden and open up the page. So from the first sight, it looks like a regular website with a header, some content, some navigation on the site, and some footer, right? So we can see that it says CSS Garden is one kind of in the header of the page. We can see a number of paragraphs here, for example, the road to enlightenment. But then if we click on different navigation elements, for example, let's click on apothecary. So we'll have a slightly different representation of a page, but looking at the content, you'll see that it has still the same headings, the same paragraphs, but is presented in a completely different way. So let me go back and choose another example. We can choose steel. So same page, but presented in a completely different way. Or maybe we can choose Verde Moderne. Didn't quite change much. Here we go. Here's another example. Great. So we can see that using this a single HTML and different CSS styles will allow you to actually control the presentation in various numbers of ways. So if you would like to explore it in greater detail, I would recommend you to download the HTML file that you have here, along with the CSS file that goes along with different examples, to explore how this simple HTML can actually change through CSS. So let me go back to the presentation again and continue talking about the main takeaway messages that we should learn by looking at this example of the Zen Garden. What have we learned? The same HTML page can change dramatically given if we're using a different CSS CSS file in this case, right? Or CSS rules in general. So HTML can be modified quite dramatically and be presented in various ways. The presentation can be separated from HTML content, and we saw that with the option of having an HTML file that can be downloaded and a CSS file that can be updated and maintained completely separately from the content itself. We also saw that it's possible to switch from one design to another without huge amount of effort. All we need to do is to associate our HTML page with another CSS file. Now, let me talk about the background of how CSS was developed. Initially, when HTML came about, all people were using when creating their HTML pages were using specific attributes and specific tags which are already embedded in HTML for controlling the presentation. An example of such a tag is the font tag. So I have a little piece of code here where we have a paragraph and a tag that we have never used so far. The tag, HTML tag, is called font. This tag, when used to wrap a specific text, for example, in this case, welcome to Greasy Joe's, will specify the font of the text that we're using here, right? So we can see that the font tag is specifying that the face of the font that we're using is going to be Arial. So the text will be presented as Arial. We also use B to specify that the text will need to be bold, I to specify that the text will need to be italicized, and U to highlight that the text needs to be underlined. We can also highlight the size and the color of the text. So what we're doing here is we're using font tag, which is an HTML element, and attributes to specify how this paragraph or parts of the paragraph will need to be displayed. This is very bad practice. Why? Because if you decide to change the paragraph back into if you decide to change the style of this paragraph and decide that the color will need to be orange rather than red, you'll have to go through the entire page and look into the areas of the page where you have this tag displayed as red, and then change this within the HTML. So it doesn't allow you to kind of separate the issues of the actual content that you're working with from how it needs to be presented. This is the reason why we never used the font tag. Now, understanding this gap within HTML, CSS was put forward, and in fact, it was presented to W3C among 9 other languages that were presented to W3C for consideration. The background of CSS goes back to 1994, where between the 2 years of 1994 and 96, W3C was reviewing a number of proposals which were submitted to W3C as contestants for style sheets. So from the 9 proposals which were presented to W3C, cascading HTML style sheets, at the time this was called CSS, was chosen to be the winner and was then put forward as a recommendation for people to use. Later on, the H was actually dropped because it was clear that cascading style sheets was supposed to be applied to HTML documents. So for brevity, the name has been changed to CSS. Now, the reason W3C chose the cascading HTML style sheet is because it allowed inheritance. What we'll talk about inheritance further down the presentation, but what we're thinking here is that once we have the HTML tree-like structure, then we can apply specific rules to elements, and these rules can be cascaded down, or in other ways inherited by the members of the HTML tree. Now, okay, the name was shortened, but it's also important to talk about the different specifications of CSS. So the first specification was adopted in 1996. However, this has changed further down the line. So CSS1 allowed us to control the borders, margins, alignments, fonts, and colors. But as we progressed, we realized that we need more better ways of controlling the content. For example, we need to make sure that we are able to have greater control when it comes to positioning different elements. So CSS2, which was introduced in 1998, allowed us this extra functionality, such as internationalization, as well as absolute and fixed positioning. Now, CSS 2.1 is the next version of a specification, which was introduced in 2004 and then tweaked many times till 2011. Now, what happened afterwards is that we realized that CSS is becoming a much bigger, quite a large language, and once you start maintaining the language and once you want to change things, then you'll have to update it, and you have to update the entire specification of a language. So what was proposed is to make sure that the language itself to be made modular. So CSS3 is the modular version of CSS, where we have a number of modules which are responsible for specific parts of a language, and they are responsible for adding specific features to the language. And then when it comes the time for releasing a specification as part of CSS3, you don't have to worry about the entire specification of a language, but the specification of a module in particular, right? So CSS is becoming much more flexible, and this modularity within the language allows us to come up with new features and maintain the new features better. So the new features that are appearing with CSS are related to text rotation, scaling, animation, multi-column specifications. There are a number of features which are being developed and maintained. So if you would like to know more about all of these features which are coming up in CSS or are being currently used in CSS3, you can click on this link from W3C and you'll see what kind of work is actually being conducted in the development of the specification itself, what is a recommended approach, what is still work in progress, right? So you can do this in your own time, but it's worth highlighting some of the advantages of using CSS. I mentioned already that one of the biggest advantages is that you can define CSS styles and then apply them to more than one pages. For example, if you decided that all the paragraphs within your website will need to be presented in navy, then you can simply define it separately in the cascading style sheets and then apply them to your index.html, products, about, or contact. You don't have to do it separately in every single page. So that's one of the examples. But in general, there's more than there are a huge number of advantages here. You can have greater typography, you can have better page layout, the style is actually being separated, so it becomes easier to maintain the design as well as maintain the content from the page. The styles are stored in a separate document, so you can simply change documents separately without being worried that you may actually change the rules which are responsible for the appearance. It's easier to maintain the site. You can have more consistent designs given that you will be applying a single rule across a number of pages. You can have smaller documents because your HTML will become smaller, not having all this additional information on how a specific element will need to be presented. Additionally, once you make your document smaller and separate CSS, then you start saving the bandwidth because the browser will actually remember that you had CSS downloaded onto your system already for one of the pages, and then this CSS will be used from the cache rather than downloaded from the internet when rendering any other pages that you have in your website. So there are a number of benefits here, and I think I managed to highlight the most important and the rationale, the most important benefits and the rationale in general why CSS is useful.